Welcome to the Evidences of Truth presentation series, the Joseph Smith Papyri and the Ordinances of Exaltation, Volume 1, Abraham and the Egyptian Endowment. This subject, once considered obscure and largely unimportant to most members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is increasingly becoming a topic of interest and discussion. More than ever before, people are beginning to see that these documents are truly a pearl of great price. Elder Bruce R. McConkie wrote, "It is self-evident that we have received no useless and unneeded revelations. All that the Lord does has a purpose and serves a need. He expects us to treasure up His Word, to ponder in our hearts its deep and hidden meanings, and to understand its full import." Before we begin, a few acknowledgements and disclaimers are in order. First, this video presentation is non-commercial. The presentation was created as part of my personal studies, and it is freely shared. It does not have a commercial objective, and I do not receive compensation in any form from its distribution. The copyrights and images used in this presentation are used with permission of the copyright owners. I'd like to thank the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for granting me permission to use its copyrighted photographs and images. Additionally, I'd like to thank Michael P. Lyon, Michael D. Rhodes, and the many museums that have made images available to me for non-commercial use. Lastly, this work is not an official publication of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The views expressed herein are my responsibility and do not necessarily represent the position of the Church. There are so many important principles and doctrines in the Gospel of Jesus Christ. Why should Latter-day Saints take time to study the Joseph Smith Papyri? One possible answer is that the Joseph Smith Papyri add precious insights into the plan of salvation and its sacred priesthood ordinances. Elder Bruce R. McConkie wrote, "Ordinances of exaltation are performed in the temples for both the living and the dead. Their essential portions have been the same in all dispensations when the fullness of the sealing power has been exercised by the Lord's prophets. They were given in modern times to the prophet Joseph Smith by revelation, many things connected with them being translated by the prophet from the papyrus upon which the Book of Abraham was recorded. By learning what Abraham taught the Egyptians about the plan of salvation and the ordinances of exaltation, we can strengthen our understanding of the gospel, increase our faith, and deepen our temple worship experience." The critics of the prophet Joseph Smith see these documents in a different light. As Hugh Nibley wrote, "The Book of Abraham has always been regarded by critics as the Mormon Achilles' heel. Against the professors, Smith had no case." So which is it, a pearl of great price, or the Achilles' heel of Mormonism? To answer that question, we'll review these Egyptian papyri that have come to be known as the Joseph Smith Papyri. We'll start by going back to the beginning to understand where these documents came from. Joseph Smith was known to say, "If we start right, it is easy to go right all the time. But if we start wrong, we may go wrong, and it will be a hard matter to get right." So let's do our best to start right. Let's go back to the beginning. Our story starts with Abraham. Abraham is always regarded in the Old Testament as the founder of the covenant race, which is personified in the house of Israel. He is the father of the faithful. Latter-day Revelation has clarified the significance of the Abrahamic covenant and other aspects of Abraham's life and ministry. We learn that he was greatly blessed with divine revelation concerning the planetary system, the creation of the earth, and the premortal activities of the spirits of mankind. One of the most valiant spirits in the premortal life, he was chosen to be a leader in the kingdom of God before he was born into this world. We also learn from latter-day Revelation that because of Abraham's faithfulness, he is now exalted and sits upon a throne in eternity. The covenant which all faithful men have made with God since the time of Adam is known as the Abrahamic covenant. The fruits of that covenant are summarized by the 3 P's, namely, priesthood, posterity, and promised land. From an eternal perspective, the Abrahamic covenant results in the blessings of eternal priesthood, eternal increase, and an eternal exaltation in the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, the ultimate promised land. Many believe that Abraham was born about 2,000 years after the fall. From the biblical chronology, we know that Noah was still alive during the early years of Abraham's life. With the population of the world being relatively small, It seems most likely that Abraham was personally acquainted with Noah. At the very least, we know that Abraham knew of Noah and was familiar with his life and teachings. For the Lord said to Abraham, "As it was with Noah, so shall it be with thee." From the beginning, God has blessed man with priesthood authority. The prophet Joseph Smith taught that Adam received the priesthood in the creation before the world was formed. That priesthood was passed down from Adam to his faithful descendants. Unfortunately, Abraham was raised in a family where his father had turned from righteousness, and therefore was unable to confer the priesthood upon him. However, because Abraham was righteous, he sought for and received an ordination to the priesthood under the hands of Melchizedek. Said he, "I have sought for the blessings of the fathers, desiring also to be one who possessed great knowledge, and to be a greater follower of righteousness, and to be a father of many nations, and desiring to receive instructions and to keep the commandments of God, I became a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers." In the Doctrine and Covenants, we learn that Abraham received the priesthood from Melchizedek, who received it through the lineage of the fathers, even till Noah, and from Noah till Enoch back to the man Adam. The prophet Joseph Smith referred to Abraham's relationship with the righteous patriarch Melchizedek when he wrote, "Abraham says to Melchizedek, I believe all that thou hast taught me concerning the priesthood and the coming of the Son of Man. So Melchizedek ordained Abraham and sent him away. Abraham rejoiced, saying, Now I have a priesthood." Abraham was raised in Ur of Chaldea. There he received the Urim and Thummim from the Lord. Then he was led by the Lord to settle in Haran, where the Lord appeared unto him. Later he was led from Haran to the land of Canaan, and was promised, "Unto thy seed will I give this land." Because of famine in Canaan, Abraham and his family went into Egypt. Abraham lived in Egypt, where he mingled with royalty, instructed Pharaoh's court on the subject of astronomy, and no doubt taught the truths of the everlasting gospel whenever the occasion arose. Before arriving in Egypt, Abraham was shown the stars and the planets and the intelligences that were organized before the world was, and he was commanded to teach these things to the Egyptians. In Abraham 3:15 we read, "And the Lord said unto me, Abraham, I show these things unto thee before ye go into Egypt, that you may declare all these words." Joseph Smith taught that the learning of the Egyptians and their knowledge of astronomy was no doubt taught them by Abraham and Joseph, as their records testify, who received it from the Lord. In like manner, the Jewish historian Josephus wrote that Abraham communicated to them arithmetic, and delivered to them the science of astronomy, for before Abram came into Egypt, they were unacquainted with those parts of learning. The writings of Josephus are a second witness to the truthfulness of Joseph's statement. When Abraham arrived in Egypt, he found religious practices patterned after the patriarchal order that had come down from the man Adam, but that were lacking in true priesthood. In Egypt, he found a descendant of Ham reigning as Pharaoh, whose government was patterned after the patriarchal governments of old, but which was devoid of priesthood and revelation, and hence, as far as worship is concerned, had turned to idolatry. Years later, Abraham's great-grandson would rise to power in Egypt. As an instrument in God's hands, Joseph would save the world from famine and provide Egypt with incredible wealth. As a descendant of Ham, Pharaoh could not hold legitimate priesthood authority. At times in the past, the power and authority to act in the name of the Lord was bestowed upon only a few worthy males and withheld from all others. Such was the case with the descendants of Ham. In the book of Abraham we read, "Now the first government of Egypt was established by Pharaoh, the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham, and it was after the manner of the government of Ham, which was patriarchal. Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations. And in the days of the first patriarchal reign, even in the reign of Adam, and also of Noah, his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth, and with the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him as pertaining to the priesthood. Since Pharaoh was of that lineage by which he could not have right of the priesthood, his descendants began to feign claim the priesthood, from Noah through Ham. And of course, to feign means to accept a counterfeit when the authentic thing cannot be obtained. The pharaohs of Egypt made false claim to the priesthood when they knew they did not have it. But they also sought earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations. What is the order established by the fathers that these pharaohs sought so earnestly to imitate? The order established by the fathers is nothing less than the fullness of the priesthood and its holy ordinances, including those ordinances performed in sacred temple ceremonies. In the Book of Mormon, the prophet Alma taught that priests are ordained to the high priesthood after the order of the Son, meaning the Son of God. The order was established before the foundation of the world, and the ordinances of the priesthood were given that people might look forward to Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and be a type of his order. And so we see that without proper authority, the Egyptians were performing priesthood ordinances that were established in the beginning by God and handed down through Adam and Noah. On May 3rd, 1842, when the prophet Joseph Smith introduced the temple endowment in the red brick store in Nauvoo, Illinois, he said that he instituted the ancient order. Joseph wrote that he spent the day in council with brethren, instructing them in the principles and order of the priesthood, attending to washings, anointings, endowments, and the communication of keys pertaining to the Aaronic priesthood, and so on to the highest order of the Melchizedek priesthood, setting forth the order pertaining to the Ancient of Days, and all those plans and principles by which anyone is enabled to secure the fullness of those blessings which have been prepared for the church of the firstborn, and to come up and abide in the presence of Elohim in the eternal worlds. In this council was instituted the ancient order of things for the first time in these last days, and there was nothing made known to these men but what will be made known to all the saints of the last days, so soon as they are prepared to receive and a proper place is prepared to communicate them, even to the weakest of the saints. Therefore let the saints be diligent in building the temple. In the early days of the church, endowed members were organized into a quorum that was at times referred to as the Holy Order or the Ancient Order. By earnestly seeking to imitate that order established by the fathers, the Egyptians performed sacred temple ordinances that were established by God in the beginning and handed down through the descendants of Adam and Noah. The details of those ordinances were preserved on papyri for almost 4,000 years, until they fell into Joseph Smith's hands. One may naturally be inclined to ask, how do the ordinances recorded on the Egyptian papyri compare to the temple ordinances restored by the prophet Joseph Smith in our day? The answer is they are strikingly similar. In fact, they are essentially the same. In his book, Temple and Cosmos, Hugh Nibley wrote that the ordinances of the Egyptian temple were essentially the same as those performed in ours. He also said they have a common origin, and Pharaoh made a very good imitation, seeking very earnestly to imitate that order which went back to the beginning. The Egyptian result is a very good imitation of our temple ordinances. So how do ancient Egyptian papyri fall into Joseph Smith's hands and become known as the Joseph Smith Papyri? Well, on the 3rd of July, 1835, a man named Michael Chandler brought 4 Egyptian mummies and several rolls of papyrus to Kirtland, Ohio. The mummies and papyri had been discovered in Egypt several years earlier by Antonio Lobolo. Kirtland was one of the many stops in the eastern United States for Chandler's mummy exhibition. Chandler was offering the mummies and rolls of papyrus for sale, and at the urging of the prophet Joseph Smith, several members of the church donated money to purchase them. In a statement dated July 5, 1835, Joseph Smith recorded the following: "I commenced the translation of some of the characters or hieroglyphs, and much to our joy found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another the writings of Joseph of Egypt. Truly we can say the Lord is beginning to reveal the abundance of peace and truth." Now originally, we know Michael Chandler had more than 4 mummies. By some accounts, he had 11. Of the 11 mummies initially acquired, 2 were sold in the summer of 1833 to Dr. Samuel George Morton at the Academy of Natural Science in Philadelphia, where they were dissected as cadavers at the medical school. The others were sold to gentlemen for private museums, and in consequence, are kept from the public. Joseph Smith's acquisition of the mummies and papyri created quite a sensation throughout the church. Almost immediately, false rumors began to spread that the mummies were those of Abraham or Joseph of Egypt. But in a letter published in the Messenger and Advocate newspaper, Oliver Cowdery publicly denounced these rumors as utterly false. Regardless, many members continued to believe that the mummies were those of famous kings and queens of Egypt. For example, Jerusha Walker Blanchard, the oldest granddaughter of Joseph Smith's brother Hiram, remembered playing hide-and-seek with her cousins. Her favorite hiding place, she said, was in an old wardrobe which contained the mummies. She recalled that there were 3 mummies, the old Egyptian king, the queen, and their daughter, and that in the arms of the old king lay the roll of papyrus from which our prophet translated the Book of Abraham. The Egyptian papyri made quite an impression on early church members. Oliver Cowdery wrote about the Egyptian records in a letter to William Fry, which was printed in the Messenger and Advocate newspaper in December 1835. He wrote, "The language in which the record is written is very comprehensive, and many of the hieroglyphics exceedingly striking. The evidence is apparent upon the face that they were written by persons acquainted with the history of the creation, the fall of man, and more or less of the correct ideas of notions of the deity. Enoch's pillar, as mentioned by Josephus, is upon the same roll. The inner end of the same roll, Joseph's record, presents a representation of the judgment. At one view you behold the Savior seated upon his throne, crowned and holding the scepters of righteousness and power, before whom also are assembled the 12 tribes of Israel, the nations, languages, and tongues of the earth, the kingdoms of the world over which Satan is represented as reigning. Michael the archangel holding the key of the bottomless pit, and at the same time the devil is being chained and shut up in the bottomless pit. But upon this last scene, I am able only to give you a shadow to the real picture. I am certain it cannot be viewed without filling the mind with awe." Many of the scenes Oliver describes are not found on the few papyri fragments still extant today. Oliver's letter, along with a plethora of other eyewitness accounts, confirm that today we only have a small portion of the papyri that Joseph Smith once had in his possession. Early church leaders Wilford Woodruff and Parley P. Pratt recorded their impressions of the Egyptian papyri. Elder Woodruff wrote, "Truly the Lord has raised up Joseph the seer of the seed of Abraham, and is now clothing him with mighty power and wisdom and knowledge, to reveal the mysteries of the kingdom of God, to translate ancient records as old as Abraham, which causes our hearts to burn within us, while we behold their glorious truths opened unto us." Elder Pratt wrote, "When we read the book of Abraham, with the reflection that its light has burst upon the world after a silence of 3,000 or 4,000 years, during which it has slumbered in the bosom of the dead, and been sealed up in the sacred archives of Egypt's moldering ruins, we are lost in astonishment and admiration. The morning of celestial light has dawned." These apostles of the Lord recognized that God had protected and preserved these Egyptian documents for thousands of years until they could be brought forward when the gospel of Jesus Christ was once again upon the earth. Throughout the early history of the Church, we find many interesting references to the mummies and to the papyri. One such example comes from teenager Zina Huntington. At one point, the mummies were hidden under her bed to protect them from apostates during the Church's early turbulent years. Candle in hand, Zina opened the door of her dark bedroom. In the dim light, she could see the 4 black shapes protruding from under the big hand-carved wooden bed. They were the sarcophagi, each containing the mummified body of an ancient Egyptian, enough to frighten the sleep out of any teenage youngster. But Zina was not to be frightened by a few mummies, Egyptian or otherwise. She set her candlestick down on the chest of drawers, matter-of-factly dressed for bed, and went to sleep wondering if the permanent sleepers beneath her had been nobles or kings or just ordinary folks like herself. The 4 sarcophagi had been placed in the Huntington home for safekeeping. Apostates and other enemies of the church in Kirtland, Ohio, were attempting to seize all church property. To protect the mummies from seizure, they were removed from the temple and stored under Zina's bed. These were the mummies purchased by the church along with the hieroglyphic manuscript of the Book of Abraham. In addition to the details of sacred priesthood ordinances, the Egyptian papyri contained writings that were translated by the prophet Joseph Smith and published as the Book of Abraham. The Book of Abraham was published in 3 excerpts in the Times and Seasons newspaper beginning in March 1842 at Nauvoo, Illinois. Joseph Smith indicated he would publish more of the Book of Abraham at a later date, but he was martyred before he was able to do so. The Book of Abraham was published with 3 facsimiles or replicas of the vignettes found on the Egyptian papyri. Even though facsimile number 3 reveals the papyri contained writings about Abraham in Egypt, the published text of the Book of Abraham ends before he arrives in Egypt. From this and many eyewitness accounts, we know that only a small portion of the material in Joseph's possession was incorporated into the published text of the Book of Abraham. These are photographs of the printing plates used to publish the facsimiles of the Egyptian drawings, also known as vignettes, that were found on the papyri. On the 23rd of February, 1842, the prophet Joseph Smith asked Reuben Hedlock, a professional wood engraver and member of the church, to prepare printing plates of 3 of the Egyptian vignettes so they could be printed. Hedlock finished the engravings in 1 week, and Joseph Smith published the facsimiles along with the Book of Abraham. The facsimiles were published with accompanying explanations provided by the prophet Joseph. When Joseph's translation of the Book of Abraham was first published, it included a header which read, "A translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt, purporting to be the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus." The modern version of the header to the Book of Abraham excludes the words "purporting to be" and states simply, "the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt." Because the few fragments of the Joseph Smith papyri recovered from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City do not date to the time of Abraham, rather they date to between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, critics of the prophet Joseph have objected to the header and claim that it is not possible that any of the papyrus in Joseph's possession was written by Abraham. First, it's important to recognize that none of the fragments recovered thus far contain the text of the Book of Abraham. As such, no one can know for sure the date of the papyri from which Joseph translated the Book of Abraham. While many presume that all of the mummies in the papyri in Joseph's possession were from similar locations in Egypt and dated to similar time frames, those are merely assumptions without validation. Further, Joseph's original header included the words "purporting to be the writings of Abraham," which indicates that the document itself was the source of the claim that the text had originally been written by Abraham. As you know, it is common to refer to an author's works as his writings, whether he penned them himself, dictated them to others, or others copied his writings later. It is well known that throughout history, important documents were regularly recopied as they succumbed to the ravages of time. For example, the earliest known fragments of Paul's letters do not date to the time of Paul, even though those documents repeatedly state they were written by Paul's own hand. Quote, "I, Paul, have written it with mine own hand." Unquote. In like manner, the papyri from which Joseph translated the Book of Abraham could state they were written by Abraham, as Joseph informs us they do, even if those documents do not date to the time of Abraham. Joseph Smith fully intended to continue his work of translating and publishing the text of the papyri. The Times and Seasons newspaper, dated February 1st, 1843, has the following notice, written by John Taylor, who succeeded the prophet as the newspaper's editor. "We would further state that we had the promise of Brother Joseph to furnish us with further extracts from the Book of Abraham. These, with other articles that we expect from his pen, the continuation of his history, and the resources that we have of obtaining interesting matter, together with our humble endeavors, we trust will make the paper sufficiently interesting." Tragically, Joseph's life was cut short, and the additional translations promised were never delivered. There are numerous eyewitness accounts attesting to the large amount of papyri originally in Joseph's possession. For the sake of time, I'll share just 2 quick examples. First, President Joseph F. Smith, nephew of the prophet Joseph, recalled seeing Joseph kneeling on the floor of the front room with Egyptian manuscripts spread out all around him. And second, Oliver Cowdery, a witness to the mummies and papyrus scrolls when they were acquired, wrote that judging from their size and the comprehensiveness of the language, the publication of the text might require multiple volumes. In short, only small fragments of the long papyrus scrolls once in Joseph's possession exist today. Let's now take a brief look at the history of the Joseph Smith Papyri. But first, a word of caution. Not all historical sources and witnesses are in perfect agreement. There are some details of the history which appear to contradict other details, and there are many things we simply do not know. For the purposes of this presentation, I will share the generally accepted history of how the papyri came into the possession of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. After Napoleon conquered Egypt, he opened the door to antiquities dealers, who then came in and plundered Egypt. The mummies in the Egyptian papyri found their way into the hands of Antonio Lobolo. After Lobolo's death, his family sent the mummies to America through the shipping company of Albano Oblasser. In America, Michael Chandler took possession of the mummies and sold them to Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio in 1835. Joseph transferred ownership of the mummies to his mother, Lucy Mack Smith. After her death, Emma Smith and her new husband sold the mummies to Abel Combs. For much of the history of the Joseph Smith papyri, it was believed that they were transferred to the St. Louis Museum and then to the Wood Museum in Chicago, where they were destroyed in a fire in 1871. What was later learned was that not all of the papyri were transferred to the St. Louis Museum. A few papyri fragments were passed to Abel's nurse or housekeeper, who later gave them to her daughter. Her daughter then sold them to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where they remained for many years. In 1967, the museum gave the fragments back to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. After receiving the fragments of the Joseph Smith papyri, the Church immediately published them. Some misinformed critics claim the Church has hid these documents from its members. In doing so, they imply a sinister motive, a desire to keep them from being examined publicly out of fear they would undermine the prophet Joseph Smith. Nothing could be further from the truth. After receiving the documents in late November 1967, they were immediately prepared for printing and were published in their entirety in the January 1968 Improvement Era, the Church's official magazine. In fact, the papyri went to print so quickly that the fragments were assigned numbers that were out of order with the text. Per precedent, the fragment numbers assigned in that first printing continue in use until today. The publication of the papyri fragments created a great deal of excitement, both inside the church and out. Critics immediately began comparing the text on the fragments to the published text of the Book of Abraham. When the texts did not align, many rushed to judgment and assumed they now had solid evidence to show that Joseph Smith was a fraud. In response, the famed scholar Hugh Nibley published a groundbreaking work titled The Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, an Egyptian Endowment. This book contained the first widely distributed translations of fragments 11 and 10. Hugh Nibley wrote, "This book had to be written because a great fuss was being made about a scrap of papyrus. Some people were endlessly dinning into the ears of the public that what was written on this small and battered strip proved beyond a doubt that Joseph Smith was a fraud, because he thought it contained the Book of Abraham, whereas it contains nothing of the sort. But who said he thought so? They did."